The auction block in Richmond, Virginia stood 6 feet high enough that every buyer in the crowd could see what they came for. On a humid morning in September 1849, a woman named Sarah climbed those wooden steps. She was 19 years old, though the auctioneer would claim she was 16. Young sells better. But Sarah wasn't being sold for the tobacco fields or the big house kitchen. The men examining her weren't checking her hands for calluses or her back for scars. They were counting the years she had left to breed. This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This is American history that we've been trained not to see. In 1808, when Congress banned the international slave trade, Virginia's economy was dying. Tobacco had drained the soil, the grand plantations were crumbling, but the Deep South was exploding with cotton, and cotton needed bodies. So Virginia transformed itself into something monstrous, a breeding ground for human beings. Between 1810 and 1860, Virginia would export between 300,000 and 350,000 enslaved people to the Deep South. Not through raids, not through capture, through forced reproduction, through breeding farms that operated with the same cold efficiency as livestock operations. Except the livestock could cry, could beg, could watch their children disappear down dusty roads, knowing they'd never see them again. The evidence sits in archives across Virginia, written in the same careful script that recorded tobacco harvests and horse sales. Thomas Jefferson's own farm book, preserved at Monticello, tracks births among the enslaved with meticulous detail. Each new child carefully noted, their future value already calculated. In 1820, he wrote to Joel Yancey about a woman who brings a child every 2 years being more profitable than the best man of the farm. More profitable. Those 2 words contained an entire system of horror. But to understand how Virginia became a breeding state, you have to understand the numbers. In 1790, Virginia held 293,000 enslaved people, 40% of America's enslaved population. By 1860, despite selling hundreds of thousands south, Virginia still held 490,000. The only way those numbers work is through industrial-scale forced reproduction. Women weren't just expected to have children, they were required to. Their value, literally written in dollars and cents, depended on it. Martha Jackson, interviewed in 1937 as part of the Federal Writers Project, remembered her grandmother's stories from a Louisa County plantation. Rose Williams left us her testimony, recorded when she was over 90 years old, her memory still sharp as broken glass. She was 16 when her master in Texas told her she would be moving into a cabin with Rufus. She had never spoken to Rufus. She didn't want Rufus. But her master made it clear: produce children with Rufus or be sold to a place where they would whip her until the blood ran. Rose described barricading herself in the cabin corner with a poker, fighting Rufus off night after night until hunger and exhaustion and the constant threats broke her will. "I never loved him," she said simply, "but I had 6 children by him." Master got what he wanted. The term breeding farm wasn't some later historical interpretation. It appeared in contemporary documents. In 1858, a British journalist visiting Virginia reported plantations where the business of raising slaves for market was systematically pursued. The Richmond Enquirer in 1859 advertised women as good breeders. A slave trader's letter from 1834, preserved in the Library of Congress, discusses Virginia being the mother state that produces stock for the southern market. But these weren't just business transactions inscribed in ledgers. Each entry represented a human being whose fundamental humanity was being denied in the most intimate way possible. Women spoke in coded testimonies about being put with men, about masters who would make you take a husband whether you want one or not, about the particular torture of bearing children you couldn't protect, raising babies you couldn't keep. Fanny Berry, born enslaved in Virginia, told her interviewer about women who fought back with the only tools they had. Some used cotton root tea to prevent pregnancy. Others chewed wild tansy or pennyroyal, risking poisoning themselves rather than bring another child into bondage. These acts of resistance were met with savage punishment if discovered. Whippings, starvation, sale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. The mathematics of human breeding were simple and ruthless. A healthy enslaved woman who began having children at 15 could produce 10 to 12 babies before her body gave out. At an average value of $800 per child by 1850, more than most Americans made in 3 years, a single woman could generate nearly $10,000 in human property. The enslaved had a word for this: mother of money. Your womb was your curse. Frederick Douglass wrote about Maryland plantations where men were brought in specifically for breeding, moving from farm to farm like borrowed bulls. These men, often called stockmen in plantation records, might father dozens of children across multiple plantations, never knowing their names, never seeing them grow. The children themselves grew up knowing their mothers but rarely their fathers, creating generations of fractured families that slavery's defenders would later use as evidence of black inability to form stable homes, a cruel irony that echoes through history. In 1832, a Virginia planter named Thomas Dew wrote a defense of slavery that accidentally revealed the system's truth. He calculated that Virginia's enslaved population, through natural increase alone, was worth $24 million annually to the state. Natural increase. As if there was anything natural about forced pregnancy, about women bred like animals, about children valued by the pound. The separation started early. By age 8 or 10, sometimes younger if the child showed particular value, they would be sold. The Richmond slave markets operated 6 days a week, closed only on Sundays for the appearance of Christian morality. Mothers would sometimes be allowed to walk their children to the auction house, a final cruelty disguised as mercy. Lucy Delaney remembered her mother's last words to her: "Be a good girl, and the Lord will bring us together again." They never saw each other again. The traders had a routine. Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trading firm in American history, moved thousands of Virginia-born enslaved people to the Deep South every year. Their ships, the Tribune, the Uncas, the Isaac Franklin, left Alexandria and Richmond monthly, packed with human cargo bred in Virginia for the cotton fields of Mississippi and Louisiana. The manifests survive: age 8, age 9, age 11, listed like inventory, priced by potential. But the breeding farms weren't just about quantity, they were about quality control. Plantations kept breeding books, some still exist in Virginia archives, tracking bloodlines like thoroughbred horses: height, weight, skin color, perceived intelligence, specific skills. Women who produced healthy children regularly were fed better, given lighter work during pregnancy. Those who couldn't or wouldn't reproduce faced the constant threat of sale to the killing fields of the Deep South. Mary Reynolds, born on a Louisiana plantation to a woman sold from Virginia, described how her mother would wake up screaming decades after slavery ended, calling the names of children sold away. She had 14 babies, Mary said, and only got to keep 3 past walking age. The mathematics of grief. 14 minus 11 equals a lifetime of haunting. Some women chose death over breeding. The James River, which runs through the heart of Virginia's plantation country, claimed an unknown number of enslaved women who walked into its waters with stones in their pockets rather than bear another child for sale. Their names are lost. Their stories survive only in whispered references in other enslaved people's testimonies. Sarah, who went to the river, that girl who chose the water over the breeding. The medical torture added another layer of horror. White doctors, building careers on experimentation, used enslaved women to develop gynecological procedures. Dr. James Marion Sims, later celebrated as the father of modern gynecology, perfected his techniques on enslaved women without anesthesia, purchasing them specifically for their reproductive issues, operating on them dozens of times. These women, Annika, Lucy, Betsy, and others whose names weren't recorded, endured medical torture in the name of improving breeding success rates. By 1860, the internal slave trade generated more revenue than all other American businesses combined except for grain. Virginia led this industry, its economy recovered and thriving on the wombs of enslaved women. The Confederate Constitution, drafted in 1861, specifically protected the interstate slave trade, acknowledging what everyone knew but rarely stated plainly. The South's economy depended not just on slavery, but on breeding slaves. When the Civil War ended, 4 million enslaved people were freed. But freedom came with nothing: no land, no reparations, no acknowledgement of the systematic sexual violence that created much of America's wealth. The breeding farms disappeared into history, replaced by rose-coloured myths of genteel plantations and faithful servants. Virginia textbooks, well into the 1970s, described slavery as a benevolent institution, where servants were cared for from cradle to grave. But the evidence remains, in court records where women sued for freedom, describing their children sold away, in plantation ledgers that list human births next to crop yields, in the DNA of millions of African Americans whose ancestry tracks back to Virginia, then scatters across the Deep South in patterns that match the old slave trading routes, in the testimony of those who survived, who spoke their truth to anyone brave enough to listen. Sarah, who stood on that Richmond auction block in 1849, was sold to a buyer from Alabama for $1,200. The record notes she was warranted sound and a good breeder. She had already given birth to 3 children in Virginia. She would have 7 more in Alabama. Not one of them would remain with her past the age of 10. This was not an exception. This was the system working exactly as designed. Today, highways run over the old slave trading routes. Shopping centres stand where auction blocks once stood. But the ground remembers. The descendants remember. And sometimes, if you know where to look in Virginia's archives, you can still find the breeding books, the careful records of human beings reduced to their reproductive capacity, the evidence of America's most profitable and most hidden atrocity, written in fading ink, documented in careful numbers, proof that the worst stories your grandmother whispered were not only true, they were worse than she dared to tell you. This is what America built. This is what Virginia perfected. This is the history that runs through our veins, whether we acknowledge it or not. The breeding farms of Virginia, where human beings were manufactured for profit, and an entire nation counted the money while pretending not to see.